Fucking delete that real quick. 7 minutes. Lots
Oh,
of
Bulls
time.
and Raptors tonight, eh, Tony?
They're sitting everybody
Playing.
though.
What? No.
Yeah,
This
they're
is the
sitting
play-in
everybody.
game.
They're not gonna play anybody.
It's a play-in game. They got to play everybody. Bulls and Raptors, not Leafs.
I thought it was the um. Just wait.
No, they're playing everybody. It's this is play-in, right? So if they win, they play Miami, the loser of yesterday's game, like the
Oh,
8-9
they
or
sat them for the
7-8.
last game. My bad. My bad. My bad.
Yes, last game, yeah. No, this is play-in game, right? So they got to win
Yeah.
2 games
So they
to
sat
get
them
to the
last
actual
game.
playoffs.
Yeah, my bad.
Yeah.
It was an old memory.
So yeah, they got to win 2 games to get into the playoffs to play the Bucks, the number 1 team, right?
Yeah, it's gonna be a hard win, man.
Oh man, yeah, I don't
There's some
think it's
good
gonna
teams
happen.
this year, like the Bulls themselves. Like
They're
there's
not
some
bad, and the
powerhouses.
Raptors aren't as good, right?
Yeah, no.
They're a disappointment. They can't hit the three, and they don't have a deep enough bench, and
Oh,
there's a lot of problems there.
this year they've committed to being a bad team. I don't know if it's for draft or if they're trying to slough off all their salary to rebuild again. Or I
Yeah,
think the
I don't
coach is
know.
gone. End of this year,
He's
coach is
gone for
gone.
sure. Yeah, for sure he's gone. I don't know. Maybe they stopped listening to him. That
Well,
happens at a
he
point. I
needs
like him, but
players.
he's got to have something to work with. Yeah.
Like, if they give him one player, like Fred, like I don't know if how long Fred's there now. Like Fred wants to stay there, but if they don't give, I mean, he's easily as good as the last point guard, the superstar that left
Would
this
you
team.
pay him though, Tony? Because his numbers were garbage this year. I
Yeah,
wouldn't pay him.
he's still got pretty decent numbers for a losing team.
Yeah, but I don't know. He's not a really efficient
He's been
offensive
inconsistent
player.
just because there's been some real consistency issues. Like they're really relying on Barnes, I think, over. Like I know he's
Yeah,
great.
they've been.
He's a great player, but just like
He's a
come on,
great
like
player, but
can't rely on
he's
him that much in his second year. Like
he's played every position. You know what I mean? Like he can play
he
every
can, but
position.
it's just like
He
come on,
shouldn't.
man.
Yeah, he shouldn't play every position for sure.
No, for sure.
Did you see that catch Kiermaier made last night,
Oh,
catching the ball over the
over the
fence?
fence. Yeah,
Wasn't
it's
that
crazy.
great? I love him. He's I mean, he can't hit this well. He's hitting really well right now, but he's a very good defensive player, eh? Like really good. And he's a great team guy.
Yeah, there's got some. It's gonna be an interesting year. I think we might have a nice decent shot.
Yeah, yeah, so far so good. Looks like we got the character with all these comeback wins.
It's I'm for the first time I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. I'm really excited. I think they actually have a real chance
Yeah, I
this
mean
year.
those
Last
young
year,
guys, like all their batting, and they did the right thing. They gave up some offense, and other teams needed
yes,
offense, and those teams were willing to give up Gold Glovers. Like
that's right. Yeah,
so
that's
now it's like
exactly it.
I think Guerrero wants that heat. He wants to be like, okay, we got defense. Now we'll win with a 5-0 game or a 5-3 game
Yeah,
because we got the defense to make it a 5-3 game. Because I think last year was like the 9-8 games. Like it was just like, okay, you guys are the best
crazy.
defensive team, but like I know Bo Bichette's great, Guerrero's great. Second is always weakness. Center has been weak. Like they don't really
Yes.
have a set player. Like
Well, and I always found like Teoscar Hernandez was, I mean, nice guy, very good hitter, but not
great
really a
hitter.
very good defensive
No,
player.
it's just
And
he's an old school offensive player, right? Like the
yeah, like defense, he worked hard at it, but he was so bad that
yeah,
even working hard at it, he was barely acceptable, right? Like that's the problem. So they upgraded. That guy Varsho
yeah.
is a stud, eh? The
Oh,
left fielder, or
they lost about 30 to 50 runs, and then,
I
I mean,
know,
but I
yeah,
think if you're stopping 100, That's a great trade off for this team.
Well, Varsho's an animal.
Yeah,
Watch that guy, Tony. He can run. Super, super physical, talented guy, eh? Really
I was just
unbelievable.
super surprised that teams, and they got some teams that they compete against gave up players, and I'm amazed their management was like, you know what, we need offense so bad, we're gonna give Gold Glovers up for, offensive super like, I'd say stars, some close to maybe superstardom in the next couple of years
Yeah. Oh,
for
yeah.
offense, like,
Absolutely.
but they're always going to be defensive liabilities because they're just offensive first, right? So
Yep.
it's like the old Nylander, right? Like the old Nylander, just all
Yes.
offense, no defense. Like it's like, oh well, he scores 80,
He-
but he gives up 240. So,
Oh, that's going to be a good story next week, eh?
oh yeah, well
They
he's
start
one of
next
their
week,
best
I think.
defensive players this year. It's crazy the
Look
changes that have
out.
happened.
It's going to be, that's going to be warfare. Like they played Tampa and the Leafs played last night.
Every
And
every team has their nemesis, and this is their year. They got a
yes,
Pittsburgh. How about Pittsburgh had to beat theirs? Edmonton beat New York Islanders. Pittsburgh beat who was? God, who was that? I can't remember, but they had their nemesis. They had to beat Bulls. Had Jordan had to beat Detroit. Like that's the Tampa Bay. If they beat them, they're gonna win a
it's
cup.
true.
This is
It's
the
true. Yeah,
Tampa's the
like,
best team in the league. What are you gonna do?
well, Boston is though,
Well,
really,
now,
right? You know
now,
what I
but I'm
mean?
saying Tampa has
Yeah.
been best for so
But
many
yeah,
years.
they won the cups. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, once they get through Tampa, then they got to play Boston, which
I
is like
know.
the best team ever in history in terms of number of wins per year. They got like 65 wins, eh? It's
That's crazy.
crazy.
Oh,
But
five
I mean, we've
seconds.
seen this
Five
before.
seconds. 5 seconds.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a consultation specialist with S&C Lavalin. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics as our project moves through consultation round 2 of the environmental assessment phase. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input on the project along the way. So, why don't we get started? Today, we're going to talk about the evaluation of alternative road corridors to help community members understand the thinking behind and activities associated with that process. So, maybe as we move along here, I will review just some basic information that we covered last time we were together, provide you with some background, and then we'll talk about the alternatives assessment process, and then the evaluation of alternative road corridors, which is the focus of today's live stream, and then we'll talk about how you can get in contact with us. So let's move on to the project background, starting with the project location. Um, Webequay and the Supply Road project. Webequay itself is the community itself is about 250 kilometers from both Hudson Bay and James Bay, and the actual all-season road or supply road is planned to go from the airport in Webequay to the east, then to the south, then to the east again, ending up around McFalls Lake, 107 kilometers away. In terms of the purpose of the Webequay Supply Road, there's multiple purposes for the road. The first is to move materials, supplies, and people from the airport in Webequay to the McFalls Lake area. The second is to provide employment and economic development opportunities, language and culture, and to generally be able to continue to live in their community, but participate in economic activities in the region. And then finally, another purpose of the project is to help provide experience and training opportunities for youth to help encourage the pursuit of additional skills through post-secondary education as well. So to give you all a basic description of the project, I guess the key point to remember is that this is not just a two-lane gravel road. There's much more to it than that. The actual project includes a lot of other things, and I'll get into those a bit right now. Again, the road is planned to be 107 kilometers long, going from the airport in Webequie to the McFalls Lake area. Now, of those 107 kilometers, 17 are within the Webequie First Nation reserve lands. The preliminary corridor width for consideration of route alternatives is 2 kilometers. And the actual final corridor width, the right of way for the road or the cleared area for the two-lane gravel surface is 35 meters. Now, some other interesting and notable things about the project is that it'll make 3 major water body crossings. The first one is to the across Winnisk Lake from the island that the Webequie settlement sits on to the mainland, which is about a 200 to 250 meter wide crossing or span. And then there are 2 other water body crossings. The next one, as we move towards McFalls Lake, would be the crossing of the Winniskissis Channel, which is about 35 to 50 meters wide. And then the final major water body crossing as we move southeast is the crossing of the Mukatai River, and again, a similar span of 35 to 50 meters to cross the Mukatai. Now, as I mentioned, the project includes not only the two-lane gravel roadway, but also some temporary and permanent facilities, including aggregate pit and rock quarry areas, both temporary and permanent. And these would have equipment for um, processing rock, crushing rock into sizes that can be used for building the road, whether it's a finer gravel help form the base for the road, or a larger stone that can be used to protect crossing features such as culverts from eroding as well. And of course, each one of these kinds of facilities, like an aggregate pit or a rock quarry, requires an access road because they're not always right beside the main road. So these access roads and then are another part of the project, as well as any crossings or crossing structures along the access roads as well. There will also be construction camps. These are temporary camps to accommodate construction crews during construction. There will also be permanent operation and maintenance offices. And each of those would include supportive facilities such as wastewater treatment plants and potable water storage as well. And then finally, during construction of the project, areas would have to be reserved for the storage and laydown of materials and equipment as well. So it's more than just that two-lane gravel roadway. Now we're going to move to talk a little bit about the alternatives assessment process. And this is just a bit of a refresher for everyone. I think it's important that people be reminded of this as part of the environmental assessment process, the provincial process. For every undertaking or what we would call project, are what's called a reasonable range of alternatives must be considered during this environmental assessment. And so alternatives can include alternatives to and alternative methods. So what are alternatives to and what are alternative methods? Well, let's have a look here and see what they are. Alternatives to the proposed undertaking or project in our case, or Webequie Supply Road project, are what you call functionally different ways of approaching and dealing with a problem or an opportunity. And we'll get into examples in a minute. And then there are alternative methods, and alternative methods of carrying out a proposed undertaking or project are different ways of doing the same activity. So let me explain that a little bit better by giving you a couple of examples. So when we talk about alternatives to the proposed undertaking, again, these are what you call functionally different ways of approaching and dealing with a problem or opportunity. So if we can bring that slide up on the screen, I'll go through those so you can see that. So that's the alternatives to slide. The next slide over. There we are. Okay, and this will be easier to explain when I have this slide available for everyone. So when we look at that, different ways, functionally different ways of approaching a problem or opportunity. So these might include alternative modes of transport. So it could be an airship, a cargo airship. That could be one way of moving material around in an area like that. Could be a cargo hovercraft as well too. It could be a railway. There's different modes of transport that could be considered as part of the decision-making process as to what to do to address this problem or opportunity. Um, Another example might be if there were an existing trail system between the two locations that are planned to be connected, you could upgrade that existing trail system to a seasonal winter road as an alternative. You could also manage traffic demand so that maybe the need was less and less significant a need and wouldn't require consideration of a new all-season road. You could do nothing, the status quo. That's one option, or you could, as being proposed by Webquay First Nation, you could propose a new all-season road. Let's now talk a little bit about alternative methods as we move to the next slide. And again, alternative methods of carrying out the proposed undertaking are different ways of doing the same activity. So in the case of an all-season road, this could be different routes. And in our particular case with the Webequie Supply Road project, we have 3 route alternatives, appropriately named Alternative Route 1, Alternative Route 2, and Alternative Route 3. So now let's move to the evaluation of alternative road corridors, sort of the meat of the presentation today. Now that we reviewed the basic information. So when we talk about evaluating road corridors, um, we screen each alternative. And the process of screening the alternative um, it's not a small task. It involves assessing the advantages and disadvantages of the alternatives against a set of factors. And so the development of these factors was based on quite a bit of work over a fairly long period of time. A lot of it, if not most of it, was discussions with community members as to what I describe here as project area features and sensitivities that may be affected by the project. So things, I mean, community members this is their homeland. Their families have lived there for a long, very, very long time. And so with it being their homeland, they're very familiar. They have very important areas that have been identified over time and used over time. There's areas that are particularly sensitive in the view of community members that they don't want affected by the project. So um, community members in Webequay had a lot of these kinds of discussions. It was a cross section of people, elders and youth and women and men and you. I mentioned youth before, but just to get that information out there so that people could identify and flag areas that they didn't want affected by the project. And a lot of these things that are important to community members, they have another term in the environmental assessment process, and that's valued components. And a lot of work was done, particularly in 2017, in 2018, with the technical team in community meetings, where these valued components were specifically identified. And then other factors were identified through just the basic definition of the environment, and we'll get into those in a minute so you see what I'm talking about. Um, and then, of course, last but not least, Indigenous knowledge, community Indigenous knowledge. Now, some of that has been provided when they provide project area features and sensitivities, as mentioned before, but Indigenous knowledge is a very broad topic. It isn't necessarily just drawing circling areas on a map. It's stories. It takes many different forms, but that information has been collected by the community over time and is continually being collected and compiled. And then that information was considered as part of the process. And so all of this information was acquired and developed and put together and was used in helping to sort of identify those potential and screen those alternative corridors. Next slide, please. So let's get into the Webequay considerations for screening alternatives. Um, and these won't be particularly surprising. And these are only a few of them. There's many of them. These are general categories in a lot of cases, but let's look at the first one here, caribou habitat. So community members were obviously, and for good reason, very concerned about avoiding what you call fragmentation of caribou habitat. What that means is if you run a road through a critical caribou habitat, it could, you are in a sense dividing that habitat because you're creating a bit of a barrier. Um, so the idea was that community members kept saying that they wanted to limit the amount of disruption and fragmentation, the breaking up of that caribou habitat. Um, in terms of identifying where the best route would be. So that was a big consideration. Another consideration was culturally significant features, either natural features or built features. And this was kind of covered before when I talked a bit about project area features and sensitivities. So um, these are areas that are very special to community members. For a lot of it could be for spiritual reasons, for many different reasons. So those are key. That's another key consideration by the community. Areas used intensively for traditional activities. So areas used for fishing, for hunting, for collection of medicinal plants. All those kinds of traditional activities, powwow areas. I mean, there's a lot of different areas with that have meaning to community members, and they don't want impacted as well too. And then the last one on this list, but certainly not the. We've got another slide on this coming up, but fish spawning areas. So as I mentioned, community members have this is their homeland. They're very familiar with this area. They have lived off the land for many, many years, and if anyone knows, community members know where the fish spawning areas are. And I remember when we were planning our field surveys for fish and fish habitat, and our technical team came up with, based on scientific knowledge, they came up with specific areas that are suitable for spawning for different species. And then we took that back to a group of community members, and then they refined that by adjusting the locations and adding new locations, because they're familiar with the land and waters that make up their homeland. So, um, making sure these areas were not disturbed, or that any disturbance was temporary and minimal, was really important to community members. Move on to the next slide now. Another key factor was seasonal hunting areas. Community members want these areas to be remote, or what you call, I have on the screen, buffered from the road corridor. So a minimal distance from the road corridor. So the road can't get too close to these areas. That's what we mean by buffer. It's an area, protective sort of zone around the road to reduce impacts of the road on sensitive areas. Another area that was brought up by community members was moose mating areas. Of course, moose are such a huge source of food, of protein to community members, that it's really important to sustain that moose population. And one of the key ways to do that is by limiting impacts of the development of the road on these moose mating areas. And then finally, last but not least, is a community source of spring water. Spring water is important to many community members, and it is important that the areas where spring water is taken by community members are protected in a safe distance from the road corridor. Next slide, please. So beyond the community considerations, there were some other considerations, additional ones. Some of these were brought up by community members as well too, but they included things like, and these are not small considerations, but socioeconomic environment, so business impacts. If community members are running an outfitting business in the area, how would that be impacted by an all-season road being road being built? And so I mean, there's all kinds of factors. There's social impacts as well too. So, socioeconomic environment is a very, very broad definition and includes a lot. So I don't mean to shortchange it by just talking about business impacts on outfitters, but it's a serious, it's a major factor to be considered. And again, we talked a bit about this earlier. I think it was covered by some of the other factors, but cultural heritage resources and environment, like archaeological potential, built heritage resources, burial sites, spiritually significant areas. These are major considerations as well too. Built environment. When we talk about that, we can talk about some of the land use planning that Webequie has been undertaking over the last few years and are trying to finalize with Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry in specifically their community-based land use plan. So the community has is in the process of finalizing this plan, identifying different use areas, some areas for development, and the nature of development that they might be willing to allow in those particular areas. And so that process itself has been quite helpful, and certainly has fed into the process of planning the Webequie Supply Road as well. Then we look at natural environment, and these are just a few factors, but air, noise, and water body crossings are other considerations for screening the alternative corridors. And then finally, it's a general term, but technical considerations. This one relating mainly to constructability, how buildable the road is, and cost of building the road as well too, because obviously um, costs can change depending on the kind of terrain that the road is being built within. So then, as we move to the next slide, as part of this process, we look at each factor and then we look at each alternative, and then we identify advantages and disadvantages in relation to each factor. So we go through this process and in quite a bit of detail and identify. So if I don't know if you can read it very clearly on the screen here, but you have seasonal hunting areas, areas used intensively for traditional activities, business impacts, and then you have advantages and disadvantages of each. So we go through each of these factors as in a very comprehensive process, and then look at sort of the net or end result of all of these to identify a potentially a preferred route. Next slide, please. So at the end of this entire process, this resulted in a preferred road corridor. So a 2 kilometer wide road corridor came out of this, and so it was a long process involving a lot of people, a lot of input from people over a fairly long period of time, but a preferred corridor was identified. And if we move to the next slide, I will go through quickly some of the key like rationale or reasons for why that corridor was preferred, why the preferred corridor became the preferred corridor. Um, so just to run through these, the route is further east and away from significant hunting areas. It runs east of areas that are used most intensively for traditional activities to the south of the settlement, the actual populated area on reserve. It minimizes impacts on moose mating areas that are typically south of the area. Um, it minimizes effects to built heritage resources. Now, examples of that might be hunt cabins or hunting blinds or sacred sites as well, burial sites. Um, it minimizes impacts on Webequie reserve lands. It minimizes the number of water body crossings, which is important to minimize aquatic habitat impacts and also to keep construction costs down, because building large structures to cross big spans on water courses is expensive. Um, and again, minimizes, I mentioned, impacts on fish and fish habitat with fewer crossings. And then when there are large crossings, we try to minimize that to find the shortest crossing width, because that's typically the least amount of impact um, as well. And then, of course, the cost of construction too, trying to keep the cost of construction um, minimized to the degree possible, while also respecting community needs to stay away from sensitive areas. So there's a lot of factors involved in this process. As you can tell, there's a lot of thought um, and time spent by community members going through these um, all the different factors and trying to decide what would be the best route alternative or corridor alternative would be best for the community to limit impacts on key and sensitive features. So a lot of thought put into this, and we as we continue our series of live streams and radio shows, we'll move along through this process to give you a better idea of just how everything fits together. So we want to hear from you. If we can move to the next slide, you have our contact information on the next slide. Again, a key resource is supplyroad.ca. There's a lot of information available on that website. You can also contact us in many different ways. And you can see on your screen there's a couple of ways you can contact us. We're always looking forward to your input. We want to try and make this environmental assessment as comprehensive and inclusive as possible. So we look forward to hearing from you, and we will be back again soon. That wraps up today's overview of the alternatives assessment process um, and screening of alternative corridors. We hope this was helpful and encourages you to join us again in 2 weeks. Don't forget to keep in contact with us, like I said, and with our project team through the supplyroad.ca website. You see it on your screen right now. Miigwech, and we will talk to you again in 2 weeks when we talk about the proposed criteria and indicators for evaluation of road corridor alternatives. Miigwech, and see you soon.